The assassination confession. In 1989, a former intelligence operative dying of cancer called a journalist to his hospital bedside. For 40 years, he'd kept silent about the most controversial assassination of the 20th century. What he revealed was shocking. The assassination everyone thought was committed by a lone gunman was actually a coordinated operation involving multiple shooters and government agents. He named names, described the planning meetings, and explained how the cover-up was executed. The dying operative had been a mid-level intelligence officer at the time. He wasn't one of the shooters, but he'd been involved in operational planning. For 40 years, he'd watched the official narrative, the lone gunman, the magic bullet theory. Knowing it was all a carefully constructed lie, he'd stayed silent because speaking out earlier would have meant death for him and his family. But now, dying with weeks to live, he decided truth mattered more than fear. He described how the assassination had been planned in classified meetings. Multiple intelligence agencies were involved, coordinating with organized crime. The official patsy had been selected months in advance. The real shooters were professionals brought in specifically for the operation. He explained there had been at least 3 shooters in different positions. The confusion about the number of shots, the trajectory analysis that didn't match, the witnesses who'd reported shots from different directions. All of this made sense with multiple shooters working in coordination. Most damningly, he described the immediate cover-up. Evidence was altered or destroyed within hours. Witnesses who'd seen contradictory things were intimidated or discredited. The autopsy was controlled. Key photographs disappeared. The entire crime scene was manipulated before independent investigators could examine it. When the confession was published after his death, officials denounced it as ravings of a dying man, but serious researchers found it compelling. The operative had known specific details, names, dates, places, procedures, that weren't publicly available. His account explained inconsistencies in the official story that had never been satisfactorily resolved. The confession sparked renewed investigation. Researchers examined evidence with fresh eyes. Forensic analysis revealed anomalies consistent with his account. Witnesses who'd been dismissed were interviewed again, and their testimonies suddenly made sense. The deathbed confession didn't definitively prove the conspiracy, but it fundamentally changed how serious researchers approached the assassination. What had been dismissed as conspiracy theory was revealed as documented fact by someone who'd been there. The official narrative, defended for 40 years, was exposed as a cover-up. The switched baby. In 1998, a 78-year-old former hospital nurse called her daughter to her bedside. She was dying of heart failure and needed to confess something she'd kept secret for over 50 years. In 1947, she'd accidentally switched 2 newborn babies in the hospital nursery. She'd realized her mistake, but had been too frightened to admit it. For 5 decades, 2 people had been raised by the wrong families, never knowing their entire lives were built on an error she'd caused. The nurse had been young, only 22, working her first year at a major hospital. The nursery had been chaotic that night. Multiple births, understaffing, exhaustion after a double shift. She'd taken 2 babies for routine procedures and somehow, in returning them to their bassinets, had switched their identification bracelets. She'd realized her mistake hours later when she saw the babies with their mothers. The physical differences were subtle but noticeable. She'd stood frozen, trying to decide what to do. Admit the mistake and face dismissal and possibly criminal charges, or stay silent and hope no one noticed? She'd chosen silence. For 50 years, it ate at her. She'd followed both families from a distance. One of the switched babies grew up wealthy, attending private schools and prestigious universities. The other grew up working class, struggling financially, but in a loving family. As she lay dying, she couldn't bear to take the secret with her. She told her daughter everything. The names of the families, the date of the switch, all the details. After the nurse died, her daughter contacted both families. The initial response was disbelief and anger, but DNA testing proved the confession was true. The 2 people, now in their 50s, were not biologically related to the families they had grown up in. The aftermath was complicated and painful. Both individuals met their biological families, trying to build relationships with parents and siblings who were genetically related but completely foreign. One embraced his biological family and became close with them. The other found the situation too painful and chose to maintain distance. The confession raised troubling questions about the different lives the two men had lived. One had grown up with significant financial advantages his biological family couldn't have provided. The other had struggled financially, but might have had an easier life with his wealthier biological family. The nurse's confession changed 8 people's lives forever, 2 switched individuals and their 2 sets of parents. It raised profound questions about identity, family, and truth. And it left everyone wondering, was it better to know the truth even when the truth destroyed the foundation of your life? The false testimony. In 2003, a 67-year-old former police officer dying of emphysema contacted an attorney with a confession that would shatter multiple families. 25 years earlier, he'd given false testimony that had sent an innocent man to prison for murder. The man had served 2 decades before being executed. The police officer had known the real killer, but had been pressured by his superiors to frame the convenient suspect. The officer had been a detective when a high-profile murder occurred in a wealthy neighborhood. There was intense public pressure to solve the case quickly. The real suspect was the victim's business partner, who had motive, means, and opportunity. But the business partner had connections, expensive lawyers, and political influence. Instead, police focused on a poor man who'd been working construction near the crime scene. He had no alibi, a minor criminal record, and no resources to defend himself. He was the perfect scapegoat. The dying officer confessed that evidence had been manufactured. Witnesses had been coached to identify him. His supposed confession had been coerced during a 30-hour interrogation without legal representation. Physical evidence linking him to the crime had been planted. The case was a complete frame-up. He described the pressure he'd faced from superiors. Solve the case quickly. The family wanted justice. Political careers depended on closing this case. When he'd suggested investigating the business partner, he'd been told to focus on solid suspects, meaning suspects without resources to defend themselves. The officer had watched the man's execution on television. For 20 years, it had eaten at him. Now, dying and facing whatever judgment might come after death, he couldn't stay silent. When the confession was made public with supporting documentation, it sparked immediate crisis. An innocent man had been executed. The police department had knowingly framed him. The ramifications were enormous. Investigation confirmed the officer's confession. The executed man had been innocent. The business partner was guilty. When confronted with evidence, the business partner, now 72, confessed and was arrested for the murder he'd committed 25 years earlier. Multiple families were destroyed. The executed man's family finally had confirmation he'd been innocent, but vindication came too late. The business partner's family was devastated. The families of officers involved in the frame-up suffered as children discovered their fathers had been corrupt. The confession sparked debates about the death penalty. If an innocent man could be executed based on manufactured evidence, how many other wrongful executions had occurred? The deathbed confession exposed the truth, but couldn't undo the fundamental wrong. An innocent man had been executed, and no revelation could change that. The covered-up disaster. In 2007, a retired engineer dying of ALS summoned environmental lawyers to his home. For 30 years, he'd kept silent about an environmental disaster that had killed hundreds and poisoned thousands more. The company he'd worked for had covered up the cause, blaming equipment failure when the actual cause was deliberate cost-cutting that had eliminated essential safety systems. The disaster had occurred in 1977 at a chemical plant. A massive explosion and toxic gas release had killed over 300 people immediately and caused long-term health effects in thousands more. The official investigation concluded that equipment failure was to blame, a tragic accident caused by unexpected mechanical problems. But the engineer knew the truth. 6 months before the disaster, he and his team had warned management that crucial safety systems needed expensive upgrades. The systems were old, failing, and couldn't handle the increased production the company was demanding. Management had refused the upgrades, citing cost concerns. Engineers were told to make do with existing systems. When the engineer objected that this was dangerous, he was told that if he couldn't do his job, they'd find someone who could. After the disaster, the company launched a sophisticated cover-up. They blamed equipment failure on unpredictable mechanical defects rather than deferred maintenance. They hired expert witnesses who testified the disaster couldn't have been predicted. They settled lawsuits quickly to avoid discovery, and they pressured employees to stay silent. The engineer had been called to a meeting with company lawyers and executives. They told him that speaking about the pre-disaster warnings would harm the company. They reminded him that he'd signed confidentiality agreements. The implicit threats were clear. Afraid for his job and family, he'd stayed silent. For 30 years, it ate at him. Now, dying of ALS with months at most, he decided to speak. He contacted environmental lawyers and provided everything: documentation of pre-disaster warnings, emails showing management's refusal to upgrade safety systems, records proving the company had known the disaster was likely, and evidence of the post-disaster cover-up. When the lawyers went public, the response was explosive. The disaster wasn't an accident. It was a preventable tragedy caused by corporate decisions to prioritize profit over safety. Criminal investigations were launched against surviving executives. The company faced enormous new civil liability. The financial impact was devastating. The company eventually declared bankruptcy, but no amount of legal action could undo the harm. Over 300 people had died. Thousands more suffered long-term health effects. Families had spent decades believing their loved ones' deaths were tragic accidents, not knowing they were preventable casualties of corporate greed. The engineer died before the legal cases were resolved. His deathbed confession had exposed a massive cover-up and led to criminal prosecutions, but it couldn't bring back the dead or restore the health of the poisoned. The secret family. In 2012, a 71-year-old businessman dying of pancreatic cancer called his wife and children to his hospital room for a confession that would destroy his family. For 35 years, he'd maintained a second family in another city. Another wife, other children, who had no idea his other family existed. He'd supported both households, lived double lives, and kept the secret perfectly until now. The businessman had met his second wife while on a business trip in the early 1970s. He'd been married for 5 years with 2 young children, but had felt trapped. The affair was supposed to be temporary, but she'd gotten pregnant. Rather than divorce or abandon her, he'd decided to maintain both families. He'd started a business requiring frequent travel, which gave him the cover he needed. He'd spend weeks with his official family, then weeks with his secret family. For 35 years, the deception had worked. His official family believed his business required constant travel. His secret family believed he was a divorced businessman. Neither family knew about the other. He'd been meticulous: separate bank accounts, separate credit cards, separate phones. As death approached and he faced the reality that his lies would be exposed during estate settlement, he decided to confess while he could still explain himself. The reaction was devastation. His official wife felt her entire marriage had been a lie. The second wife learned their relationship had always been secondary. Both sets of children were horrified to learn they'd had siblings they'd never known existed. The financial implications were complicated. The estate became a legal nightmare. Did the second wife have any claim? Did her children have inheritance rights? Perhaps most painful were the emotional revelations. The official children learned they had half-siblings but couldn't relate to them. Attempts to build relationships were awkward and painful, colored by resentment about the deception. The businessman died 2 months after his confession. Neither family attended his funeral. He was buried with minimal ceremony, mourned by no one. The man who'd tried to have 2 families died effectively familyless, abandoned by everyone he'd claimed to love. Some family members wished he'd never confessed. If he'd stayed silent, they argued, they could have lived in ignorant happiness. Others argued that truth was always better than living a lie. Even if the truth was painful, the deathbed confession had exposed the truth, but had created more harm than healing. The wartime atrocity. In 2001, a 79-year-old veteran dying of heart failure contacted a human rights organization with a confession about events from 6 decades earlier. His unit had participated in the massacre of an entire village: men, women, and children. The military had covered it up, blaming the deaths on enemy action. For 60 years, he'd lived with the guilt. The massacre had occurred in 1942 during World War II. The veterans unit had been operating in occupied territory when they'd encountered a village suspected of harboring resistance fighters. Orders came down to deal with the village as an example. The unit had rounded up all the villagers, over 200 people including elderly, women, and children. They'd been ordered to execute everyone. The village had been burned to destroy evidence. Bodies had been buried in mass graves. The official report claimed the village had been destroyed in combat. The veteran had tried to suppress the memories, told himself he'd been following orders. But the faces of the villagers he'd helped execute never left him. As death approached, the guilt became unbearable. His confession was detailed and specific. He named the location, the date, the officers who'd given orders, and other soldiers who'd participated. Most importantly, he was willing to testify on the record. The Human Rights Organization investigated. Using wartime records, satellite imagery, and interviews with local residents, they confirmed a village had existed at the location and had been destroyed during the time frame he described. Ground-penetrating radar detected what appeared to be mass graves where he'd indicated. Excavations revealed human remains, men, women, and children who died from gunshot wounds. The physical evidence supported the veteran's confession. A massacre had occurred exactly as he'd described. The revelation sparked calls for accountability. The military eventually acknowledged that a massacre had likely occurred, though they claimed it was an isolated incident by soldiers who'd exceeded orders. Families of the victims finally had acknowledgement of what had happened to their ancestors. For decades, they'd known the truth from family oral histories, but had been told official records showed their relatives had died in combat. The veteran died shortly after his confession. His deathbed confession couldn't undo the massacre or bring back the dead, but it provided acknowledgement to victims' families and reminded the world that the convenient narratives of war often hide uncomfortable truths. The kidnapping truth. In 2014, a 68-year-old woman dying of cancer contacted FBI agents with a confession about a famous child kidnapping from 1969. Everyone believed the child had been killed by a stranger abductor. In reality, the dying woman had taken the child, snatching a baby from a hospital nursery and raising her as her own daughter. For 45 years, both families had lived incomplete lives. The kidnapper had been dealing with depression and obsession after suffering multiple miscarriages. She'd become fixated on having a baby, and her desperation had driven her to a terrible act. She'd posed as a nurse and simply walked out with a newborn while actual nurses were distracted. The baby's family had been devastated, searching desperately, believing their child had been abducted and likely killed. The case had gone cold. Meanwhile, the kidnapper had moved to a different state, created a false birth certificate, and raised the stolen child as her own daughter. She'd been a loving mother, caring, attentive, supportive. The girl had grown up happy with no idea she'd been kidnapped. For 45 years, the kidnapper had lived with her secret. She'd watched her stolen daughter grow up, graduate, get married, have children. Every moment of happiness had been shadowed by guilt and fear of exposure. As cancer advanced and death approached, she decided she couldn't die without confessing. She confessed to the FBI, providing details that proved her story. DNA testing confirmed that the 45-year-old woman was actually the missing baby stolen decades earlier. The revelation destroyed multiple lives. The stolen woman learned her entire identity was false. The woman she'd called Mom was actually her kidnapper. Her entire life history was a constructed lie. Her relationship with her biological family was incredibly complicated. They'd never stopped loving her and searching for her. But they were strangers. Meeting them felt like meeting distant relatives, not the parents she'd been stolen from as a baby. Most painful was her relationship with the dying kidnapper. Despite the terrible crime, she'd been a good mother. The stolen woman had happy childhood memories and felt genuinely loved. Learning this loving relationship was built on kidnapping was devastating. The kidnapper died a few months after her confession, before legal prosecution could proceed. The stolen woman struggled with how to remember her. To the world, she was a criminal who destroyed lives. But to the woman she'd raised, she'd been a loving mother who'd made a terrible decision, but had spent 45 years being genuinely caring. Years later, the stolen woman said she wished she'd never learned the truth. Her life had been happy. Learning she'd been kidnapped had brought only pain, identity crisis, family conflict, and loss of the only mother she'd known. The deathbed confession had reunited families, but had also torn them apart. The medical experiment. In 2009, a retired doctor dying of liver failure contacted medical ethics investigators with a confession about experiments he'd conducted in the 1970s. Working at a state psychiatric institution, he'd performed unauthorized medical experiments on patients without their knowledge or consent. The experiments had caused harm. Some patients suffered permanent damage. The institution had covered up the experiments by altering medical records. The doctor had been a young psychiatrist, ambitious and convinced that breakthrough treatments were possible if researchers could test theories more aggressively. Psychiatric institutions had little oversight, and patients had virtually no rights. He'd been testing experimental drug combinations at dosages far exceeding safe levels. Some experiments had caused seizures, neurological damage, and permanent cognitive impairment. When patients suffered adverse effects, he'd attributed them to their underlying mental illness. Medical records had been altered to hide the experimental treatments. Several patients had died during or shortly after his experiments. Their deaths had been attributed to their mental illnesses. No one had questioned whether the treatments might have caused or contributed to their deaths. Eventually, he'd stopped, not because of ethical awakening, but because better oversight made unauthorized research impossible to hide. He'd moved to a different institution, had a successful conventional career, and tried to forget what he'd done. But guilt had accumulated. As he faced death, he couldn't escape the memories of patients who'd suffered because of his experiments. He confessed to medical ethics investigators, providing detailed records. The investigators were horrified. They contacted the former psychiatric institution and demanded access to records. What they found was shocking. Not only had this doctor conducted unauthorized experiments, but several other doctors had done similar things. Investigators tracked down former patients and their families. Many patients had died, but some were still alive, still suffering effects from experiments performed decades earlier. Families learned that their loved ones' sudden deterioration hadn't been due to mental illness. It had been caused by experimental treatments given without consent. The confession sparked lawsuits and broader investigations into psychiatric institutions during that era. What they found was disturbing. Unauthorized experiments on vulnerable patients had been widespread. The dying doctor's confession didn't lead to prosecution. He died before legal action could proceed, but it did lead to acknowledgement, apology, compensation for some victims, and strengthened regulations protecting patients. For families of victims, the confession brought both relief and pain. Relief that they finally knew the truth. Pain because the truth couldn't undo the harm. The sabotaged evidence. In 2016, a former forensic technician dying of brain cancer confessed that she'd deliberately contaminated evidence in multiple criminal cases over a 15-year period. Her contamination had led to wrongful convictions, innocent people imprisoned while guilty people went free. She'd done it out of laziness, carelessness, and later to cover up her earlier mistakes. The technician had worked in a crime lab processing DNA evidence. She'd been overworked, underpaid, and burned out. She'd started taking shortcuts, not following proper protocols, and occasionally contaminating samples through careless handling. When her early mistakes had been noticed, instead of admitting errors, she'd covered them up by falsifying documentation. The cover-ups had required more lies, and eventually she was systematically sabotaging evidence. By the time she left the lab, she'd compromised hundreds of cases. For 20 years after leaving the lab, she'd tried not to think about what she'd done. But as brain cancer progressed, she could no longer avoid confronting it. She contacted defense attorneys and provided detailed confession of which cases she'd sabotaged, how she'd contaminated evidence, and which convictions might be based on her false results. Investigations confirmed her confession. Hundreds of criminal cases had to be reviewed. In dozens of cases, people had been convicted primarily on DNA evidence the technician had processed. Many were released when prosecutors acknowledged they could no longer prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. But the harm couldn't be fully undone. People had lost years of their lives imprisoned for crimes they hadn't committed. The confession also meant that guilty people had gone free. Criminals had avoided justice because evidence against them had been contaminated. The crime lab's reputation was destroyed. Every case processed during the technician's tenure was now suspect. The entire criminal justice system in the region was thrown into crisis. The technician died before facing criminal prosecution. For the wrongfully convicted who were released, the confession was both liberation and source of rage. They were grateful to be freed, but furious that one person's misconduct had stolen years of their lives. The hidden genocide. In 2018, a 94-year-old former government official, dying in a nursing home, confessed to a journalist that a genocide had occurred in his country in the 1960s, and his government had successfully covered it up for over 50 years. Official history recorded a civil disturbance with limited casualties. In reality, the military had systematically executed over 100,000 civilians from a specific ethnic group. The genocide had been planned and executed at the highest levels of government. An ethnic minority had been scapegoated for economic problems. The solution had been elimination, systematic execution of men, women, and children. The military had cordoned off regions where the minority lived, claiming they were conducting operations against rebels. In reality, they were systematically executing civilians. Over several months, over 100,000 people had been killed. The official had been a mid-level government administrator. He hadn't participated in killings, but he'd been involved in the cover-up. His role had been creating the false narrative, writing reports that blamed violence on rebel activity, and producing casualty estimates that vastly undercounted the dead. The cover-up had been sophisticated. Mass graves had been concealed. Documents had been destroyed. Witnesses who spoke out had been arrested or killed. Foreign journalists had been kept out of affected regions. For 50 years, the genocide had remained hidden. The official had kept silent out of fear and loyalty to his government. But as he reached his 90s and death approached, he could no longer live with the secret. He confessed everything to a trusted journalist. The journalist investigated using the official's information, satellite imagery, and interviews with elderly survivors. He confirmed that mass graves existed where indicated. Ground-penetrating radar showed evidence of burial sites containing potentially hundreds of bodies. When the confession and supporting evidence were published, the international response was shock. Under pressure, the government eventually allowed limited investigation. Excavations confirmed mass graves containing thousands of bodies, all from the targeted ethnic group, all killed during the time frame described. The revelation sparked internal crisis. Members of the targeted ethnic group who'd survived had always known about the genocide through family oral histories, but had been officially silenced. The confession vindicated them. Their stories had been true. The official's confession had exposed a hidden genocide and forced acknowledgement of a historical crime. But it couldn't bring back the dead, couldn't restore destroyed communities, and couldn't undo 50 years of lies. It proved that sometimes the most terrible secrets are the ones that entire governments keep, and that truth can remain buried for decades if everyone with power benefits from the lie. These 10 deathbed confessions share a common thread. They were secrets kept for decades, truths carried to the edge of death before finally being spoken. Each confession changed everything, exposing crimes, revealing lies, and forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about the past. What makes these confessions particularly powerful is their timing. The people who spoke had nothing left to lose. No career could be destroyed, no reputation ruined, no threats could silence them. Death freed them to tell truths they'd kept hidden for lifetimes. But these confessions also raise haunting questions. Why did these people wait so long? How many innocent people suffered while they stayed silent? The uncomfortable answer is that most chose comfort over truth. Speaking out earlier would have meant sacrifice, losing jobs, facing prosecution, endangering families. So, they stayed silent until facing death. Perhaps most disturbing is what these confessions suggest about secrets that were never revealed. For every deathbed confession, how many people died suddenly taking secrets with them? How many truths died in accidents or heart attacks that gave no chance for final confessions? These 10 confessions changed everything, but they represent only the secrets that happened to be revealed. The truths we know about pale compared to the truths that died with people who never spoke. The real question is, how many deadly secrets are people keeping silent right now?